In this first section of this course, I'm going to cover some of my favorite methods for exposure blending. The reality is that with the advances in camera dynamic range and also in raw editing software, the need to bracket and blend exposures has become much less common. However, there are still high contrast light situations that can require the bracketing and blending of exposures, so it's a good skill to have, and it's one that I use fairly often. And even when your camera can record the necessary highlight and shadow information in a single exposure, like in this image, there can still be quality benefits to doing something called double processing a single raw file and then blending these as if they were separate exposures in Photoshop. Double processing a raw file and blending isn't a new idea, but with improved raw file dynamic range and better raw adjustment capabilities, it's a better option now than it ever has been. So when would you want to double process and blend instead of just using the tone sliders in Lightroom to recover highlights and open up shadows? I find it useful in situations like this where the dynamic range is right on the edge of your ability to recover highlights and shadows. And what I often find is that if I find a slider arrangement that recovers the highlights in the scene and gets those looking just how I want them, in the sky here, and then I go to try to open up my shadowed areas and I'm making adjustments to that part of the image, then I can't find a perfect slider arrangement in the tone section that gets my foreground and my sky looking how I want at the same time. But in situations like this, you might think, why not just use the adjustment tools like the gradient tool in Lightroom to make separate adjustments for the sky and the land? And that is a fair question. Even though Lightroom can do a great job localizing adjustments, my feeling is that as long as I'm going to locally adjust different areas of the image, I'd rather do that in Photoshop where I can make much more refined selections and masks and also have many more adjustment tools at my disposal. The final results will inevitably be better. And for a lot of images that aren't this extreme in their needs for highlight and shadow recovery at the same time, the highlights and shadows and other tone sliders in Lightroom can do a great job. So I don't use it all the time, but with images like this, it can really be a lifesaver. So here's how I set this up. In Lightroom, I first complete any adjustments that I want to be applied to both exposures. For me, these include things like chromatic aberration removal, right there, any lens profile corrections that I might want to do. It also includes any leveling or image transformations and setting my basic white balance for the image, which this might be a little warm, and also any sharpening that I want to do to the image beforehand. But I generally don't do any tone adjustments at this point. I simply open this to edit in Photoshop, and I edit it as a smart object. And now that I'm here in Photoshop, I want to create two different layers or exposures of this image. So if you have the TK panel, you can click the duplicate layer button, and that will create a second copy of the smart object. Or if you're not using the panel, then you need to right click on that layer and come down to New Smart Object via Copy. Making smart object copies like this creates unlinked smart objects. I'm not going to go into what the different types of smart objects are right now, but if you want to learn about them, you can view this video on my YouTube channel. Now I'm going to double click the top layer to open it in Camera Raw, and this will give me access to the actual raw information of this image, and I can make raw adjustments that happen only to that top layer. And this top layer is going to be my landscape exposure. So I'm going to develop for the landscape part of the image, and I'm not going to worry about what happens to the sky. I'm going to be able to optimize my landscape to get it to look just how I want it. And I am not going to worry if the sky ends up not looking right or being overexposed. So I can get all my contrast, my highlights, my exposure, and I don't have to get it perfect right now because I can always come back and work with this later. I could also work with texture and clarity if I wanted to do that at all. And again, I'll leave that for later. Yeah, let's say that that's good for now. Bring down those highlights slightly more. When I click OK, that'll update that smart object layer in Photoshop. And now I can open up the bottom layer. And it's going to open up those raw adjustments again, but this is a completely different set of raw adjustments. So now I can make these raw adjustments just for my sky and perfectly optimize that sky just the way I want it to look and not worry about the landscape. So maybe somewhere in there. And if I even want to have a slightly different white balance for the sky, I can even do that. So I'll click OK. And there's my sky layer, or my sky exposure, underneath my landscape exposure. At this point, this is like you had taken two different exposures in your camera and had them set up as layers in Photoshop for blending. Now all I need to do is add a white mask to this top layer, and it's either this button in the layers panel or this button right here in the TK panel. And now I'm just going to use a black paintbrush to paint with a little more flow, and now I can mask through that sky exposure and bring through the proper sky exposure from the layer below, and then I can feather my mask across the transition zone. Let's bring the flow down a bit here, and I can go back to a white brush and just work that transition zone until it looks good. Now I've completed my exposure blend, but it's not with two different exposures, it's with a single exposure that's been double raw processed. And once I have that blending mask set up, I can come back to each of these layers separately and individually fine tune each of those layers. For example, if I wanted to maybe work with the white balance and also bring up some vibrance and a little bit of saturation in my foreground, it feels a little bit too blue in the shadows, somewhere in there. Get that all just how I want it, and maybe bring down the contrast a little bit more in my foreground and bring down the highlights a little bit more, and I can update that, and that'll update that lower part of the image. And I can also come up here to the upper part and maybe open up my shadows a little bit more, bring the highlights down, whatever I want to do. If I want to put a little more magenta into my sky, and click OK, and that'll update my sky exposure. So this has been a really simple example just to show you how I set up a double raw process blend. But in the next few chapters, I'll show some of my favorite exposure blending methods. These methods can either be used with multiple exposures that you shot in your camera, or you can use them with a double process raw file like this one.